So I read your book. I loved your book. It's fantastic. And I can't wait for everyone else to read it. It's a really important book. And I want to ask you about the very first story you have in the book. It talks about your grandparents who immigrated from Italy to Providence, Rhode Island. And it's such an incredible story of their journey and eventually 10 kids. And you get into this one story about your grandfather who was selling fruit on a cart, and he gets arrested one day.
Yes.
And your mom has to, or your grandmother has to go to court, and she's so nervous, and she doesn't know what's ahead. And your father goes, am I getting this right? Your father goes to translate?
Yes.
Tell me about that, because I know that you had heard that story a lot as a child.
Well, my grandparents emigrated to this country in 1912. Mm-hmm. And there was a massive emigration from Europe to the United States back in those days, people seeking a better life, and that's why they really came here. Mm-hmm. My grandmother had 10 children. My father was the fifth, and he was the first one to arrive in Rhode Island on that journey. Mm-hmm. He was a fruit peddler, and on one particular day, he and his friends, after peddling fruit all day long, decided to have a libation. And they got a little rowdy, and they got arrested. And my grandmother didn't speak English. My grandfather didn't speak English. My dad was about 13 at the time, and he spoke English.
Right.
So my grandmother receives a visit from her friend saying, your husband is in jail. Now, she don't know. She thinks jail. She's thinking of Italy. She thinks he's dead the rest of his life. Mm-hmm. So she said, you have to be in court tomorrow to get him out. So the first thing that comes to her mind is she needs money.
Right.
To go to the court. So she goes and asks all the fruit peddlers, I need money. My husband's in jail. So she goes to court the following day, and my dad is the interpreter because she don't speak English.
Right.
They bring my grandfather up. He's disheveled. He's been in the cell all night long. Mm-hmm. And with that, my grandmother jumps out of her seat, and she yells, please, Judge, no money, no jail, no jail. I have the money. And she's got all this money mm-hmm. that the other fruit peddlers gave her. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because back then there were ethnic prejudices. We're talking 1912, way back then, mm-hmm. and particularly between the Irish and the Italians. And there was an Irish judge, who was white-haired, ruddy-faced Irish judge, mm-hmm. and they expected the worst, that he's going to go to jail.
Right.
So the Irish judge says to my father, he says, are you going to interpret? He says, yes. So my grandmother's yelling, please, Judge, no jail, and she's showing the money. Mm-hmm. And the Irish judge says, young man, tell your mom that that her husband is a good man and he had a bad day, but I'm going to send him home and I want her to cook him a good meal and be nice to him.
Right.
And that changed the dynamic. Now, my grandmother had 10 children. That story was a family story about justice, about compassion, and it just... And all of the Irish, Italian prejudices in our family disappeared
right.
as a result of that one story.
Right.
But it was a story of compassion and understanding.
Right. And how much compassion and understanding do you think that your father saw growing up? Do you think that was part of his upbringing, or was it a tough upbringing for your father? Well,
it was a double shield. It was that judge, but it was also the prejudices of that day, mm-hmm. because that's when there was the most massive immigration in the history of this country around 1912, right. 1950, actually longer than that, 1920.
Right. So you were born in Providence, Rhode Island.
I was.
Tell me about your childhood.
I had a great childhood. I say I had a very privileged childhood, and I mean that in the truest sense of the word. I had a privileged childhood because I was born poor. Mm-hmm.
Now, a lot of people would think that's very tough, not a privilege. Explain that.
But I was born poor, and I appreciated everything in life. Mm-hmm. So Christmas time to me wasn't, boy, I'm going to get a bunch of toys. Mm-hmm. We had love and understanding. We went to Mass together. My father was one of 10. My mother was one of 8. And both families would get together on the holidays. And that was our holidays. It wasn't exchanging expensive gifts. It was a family unit. It was understanding and helping each other.
Right.
And that was my early childhood that I cherish.
So you remember happiness and kindness growing up?
It was full of happiness and kindness.
Yeah.
That was
yeah.
Both families.
Both families. So you're a highly educated person. Talk to me about your education and how how you had these opportunities, because you were one of the first that had opportunities like this, right?
When I was probably 10, 12 years old, we lived in a what they called a cold water flat, which means we didn't have hot running water. And our house was heated by this potbelly stove. I remember it like it was 10 minutes ago. My dad put his hand on my shoulder. He was giving me lessons about life. And he said to me, he said, someday you're going to be a lawyer.
Did you want to be a lawyer?
After that, I did.
Yeah.
I never entertained the thought.
Right.
But I'm only 10, 12 years old. I'm not thinking of my future occupation. He says, and you can't judge poor people like us.
Right.
I never wanted to be anything else except a lawyer, except I didn't realize that it was fraught with danger, because I had to then actually go to college and law school. I didn't appreciate that when I was 10.
Right.
I thought you just became a lawyer.
Right. You didn't realize how hard it could be to go down that road.
I didn't have the money to go to college, so I worked in a restaurant washing dishes and working the counter. And then after that, it was time to go to law school. And I had been accepted to Boston University School of Law, but I couldn't afford to go. So I taught school in Providence, Rhode Island, days for 2 years. And then while I was teaching, I went to night law school in Boston and drove to Boston for 4 years, nights, to get my law degree.
Can you talk about the opportunity you got to teach people? How did that come about?
Well, there was a professor at Providence College. His name was Father Quinn, and he was in charge of the education department. His family actually owned the Boston Braves baseball team.
Oh, wow.
So I figured he's never going to understand my problem. I don't have any money. And I went to see Father Quinn and explained my situation to him. He could not have been better. He says, I'm going to make sure you get all of the education requirements so you can teach. He said, but one thing you have to promise me is that you will go to law school. And I'm glad he did that, because I had many weak moments along the way.
Right. Well, it sounds like a lot of discipline was instilled in you. You had some other jobs when you were younger. I know you helped your dad on the milk truck,
yes.
right? Can you talk about that a little?
Well, I worked on, my dad would wake my brother and I up like 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning. My brother was 2 years older than I was. And we'd say, Dad, he'd say, if you don't want to do this the rest of your life, you make sure you stay in school. So he was a very firm believer in education, thankfully.
Right. Amazing. What were some challenges you ran into as you were on your path to get your law degree? Were there times where you thought, I really don't want to do this, or I can't do this?
Every time I was driving to Boston. Not really. It was a goal that I had. My father put his hand on my shoulder and said, someday you're going to be a lawyer. I was discouraged and I was tired, but I never really thought about quitting. It never entered my mind.
So failure was not an option.
Right.
Right.